Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Ann Pisor. She is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Washington State University. Her research interests include long-distance relationships and resource management, long-distance relationships and the downsides of climate change, and the evolution of human sociality, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So, Dr. Pisor, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So, tell us first, what are long-distance relationships in anthropology?
So, long distance relationships refer to social connections people have that span distance. Now, the first question you might have is how long is long? And it depends on the local ecology. So if you have a place where there's lots of variability in the landscape in terms of what people need, and we'll get into this in a bit, you might have shorter long distance relationships or longer long distance relationships. But what's important to note, and this is something that I didn't really understand when I was starting out, is that there's a difference between long-distance relationships and intergroup relationships. So when I first started doing anthropology, I was working in Bolivia. And in Bolivia, because of the political context, Bolivia is a plurinational state. And so what that means is they recognize 36 different pueblos indígenas, or indigenous groups. And because that was so much at the forefront of the political conversation there, and because intergroup relationships and between group tensions are such a common topic in evolutionary anthropology, which is where I do most of my work, I kind of assumed that intergroup relationships were really key to human sociality, and they are. But I hadn't really pulled apart and thought separately about long distance relationships. So to your question about what are they in anthropology, to archaeologists, there's something that they've been thinking about for quite a long time. They're really aware that humans have these really big social networks that span distance. But for evolutionary anthropology, it's often something we've been missing and that I missed. So long story short, long distance relationships are social connections that span distance. People have a variety of ways of maintaining them, which I'm happy to get into if you'd like. Mm-hmm. And they're really important for the human niche, and both in the past and present.
Yeah. I mean, just to joke around a little bit, I had to ask you specifically what these are in anthropology, because someone could interpret it as long-distance relationship, romantic relationships or something like that.
I always have to be like, so it's a social relationship. And granted, you can also have long-distance romantic relationships, and those would count, but to get the same kind of support, you would have to have a lot of them.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about it. What are the circumstances where people build these sort of long-distance relationships?
Yeah. So that's a good question. What are the circumstances? Because not everyone has them. And there are cultural institutions, definitely, which also is another thing we can get into, that can either encourage or limit long-distance relationships. And that can be really important. But all else equal, you should expect to see long-distance relationships in humans under two potential conditions. So first is when you have resource shortfalls that are what we would say are spatially autocorrelated. And basically what that means is that you have some kind of shortfall, maybe a drought, for example, something that we're both experiencing where we are today, where you have a lot of people who are affected. It's kind of a big geographic scope. And when that happens, that means that people who are in the community with you, so who you might see every day, people who are neighbors who can help you when you have a bad day hunting, or when you lose your job and you don't have a paycheck next week, those people are also being hit by the same circumstances. So under those circumstances, right, under these conditions, you have to reach further out to get support from a friend, whether it's a loan of money or whether it's access to a water source. The other condition is when you have a landscape that humans live in, which we often do, where the normal area where you live your life, say if you're a forager, it would be your, say, your daily range. doesn't have something in it you need. So a quintessential example of this in humans is salt. So particularly when you are living as a horticulturalist, for example, if you're in the Amazon basin, which is where I've done a lot of my work, salt occurs in these little patches across the landscape. So to get access to it, you actually have to have social connections who can provide you that access. It might be a network of people where salt passes from hand to hand, or you might actually be able to go visit and get that salt. So just to reiterate, the two conditions under which you'd expect long distance relationships are A, when you have these locally correlated shortfalls where everyone's struck at the same time and you need to reach a little further out. And then the other is when there's a resource you really need, whether it's salt or even access to a job, where locally you can't get that resource, but someone further away will have it.
Mm-hmm. Do long-distance relationships include migration, or is that something apart from it?
They certainly can. So to give you an example of how this works, I'm going to use this list of adaptations. They call them strategies, but I call them adaptations that archaeologists talked about in the 1980s. So in these adaptations, they talk about managing risk, which I'm really interested in, due to climate. And the different kinds of adaptations, which here are cultural, right? So different ways of doing things that people learn socially and use, include things like risk pooling, where you put your resources together, and then when something bad happens, someone can pull on those resources. They include things like exchange, which I mentioned. So you can get salt, for example, being exchanged hand to hand across long distances. And they also include things like, for example, resource diversification, which is something that foragers in particular engage in a lot, right? You have lots of different potential resources you can draw on, or if you're an agriculturalist, you plant lots of different crops. The thing is that most of these strategies can involve long distance relationships. So to your point about migration, migration can involve long distance relationships in the sense that if things are bad locally, what often happens is that people will go to where their long distance relationship is, and there's better opportunities there. So thinking about an example from, say, the foraging ethnographic literature, we can think about the San in southwestern Africa, and we can think about Haro relationships. So these are friendships that are kept alive through gift giving and visitation. And when things get really rough, then people in a band will basically scatter and go to where their Haro friends are living, where conditions are better. But even today, we can think about relationships, say, spanning from Central or South to North America. So you have long-distance friendships maintained through cell phone connections, through Facebook Messenger, through WhatsApp. When times get rough, as they are with climate change in Central America, people are often going to where their long-distance relationships are in North America. And so that can even be permanent migration. So the Haro example is often temporary. People go and they come back. So we might call that migration or even mobility. But other folks have to engage in permanent migration, and then they call upon their long distance relationships too. So I hope that answers your question. There's a lot of different cultural adaptations humans have for managing risk, and they often involve long distance relationships.
Mm-hmm. By the way, just to be very specific, long distance relationships, do they necessarily have to involve different tribes or different bands, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily. And that's an important thing. So I have a new paper under review, the preprints available in case people are interested, where we really try to pull this apart. Because again, I kept doing the same thing when I was thinking about human sociality. I was thinking about intergroup relationships and long distance relationships as the same thing. They're often not. So taking the example again of migrants going from, say, Central to North America, oftentimes these are people from the same communities who have just moved to the US before. Additionally, in Bolivia, again, where I've done a lot of my work, some of these long distance relationships are from the same pueblo indígena. And what's important instead is that one lives in the city and one lives in the country. Each has access to resources that the other does not. And so they do not have to cross group boundaries.
Mm-hmm. So they have the same group identity,
They
correct?
can, or they can
In
also
that case.
not. Yes, exactly. It depends on the case. But keeping the two separate is helpful because it enables us to ask distinct questions about them with respect to human sociality.
Yeah, I mean, that question came to my mind also because in a bit we're going to talk about intergroup tolerance. So I guess that this distinction or this qualification is important to make here, just for people to understand a little bit better what exactly we're talking about when we talk about long distance relationships, right?
Yep, that they are distinct. It's important.
What about other primates? Do they also have long distance relationships? Do we know anything about that?
We're learning a lot about that. So this is a question that you posed, and I saw the question and thought, do I have the current up-to-date knowledge on this? And the answer is actually that I didn't. So I talked to my colleague Cyril Goethe to figure out what the latest information was on this. So Cyril works with snub-nosed monkeys and other species as well. And what Cyril said is that snub-nosed monkeys, first of all, are very interesting for people who do not know them. So snub-nosed monkeys, for example, can be found in China. And what will happen is that during certain parts of the year, they will come together in really large groups. We're talking like 400 individuals, which is quite large for a non-human primate. And snub-nosed monkeys are organized into these kind of large bands, even within these groups. And so when they come together, they haven't seen each other for months. And so Cyril can really clearly see on GPS data that these groups are coming together. One of the hard things for primatologists is that to actually understand whether there are affiliative, that is friendly relationships between individuals from these two different bands, you have to have researchers on both sides of the interaction keeping track of what's happening. And that actually just gets really hard when you have hundreds of individuals. So Cyril says that they're still working on that question of whether there are long distance relationships. Do individuals recognize each other? Are they coming back together and having those affiliative contacts? There's definitely suggestive evidence for this from chimpanzees and from spider monkeys. So in general, these groups, what's important about them, and this will become important when we talk about humans, is that they have something called fission-fusion dynamics. And so what that means is that you have larger groups of individuals that can break off into smaller parties, we would call them. So if they're foraging parties, it might just be a day or a couple days. They're off doing their own thing. Humans do this too, right? And what happens is that these groups, these parties specifically, then come back together. And so spider monkeys, when they come back together, actually have these kind of ritualized greetings that they do. And that suggests that they know each other and that they are kind of falling back into that affiliative relationship. So what's happening with snub-nosed monkeys when they're apart for months at a time? Are they coming back together? Do they have that recognition, those affiliative relationships? We're not sure. We know quite a bit about intergroup relationships in non-human primates, but these long-distance relationships are something we're learning more about. And importantly, so far, based on what we know in non-human primates, is that these do tend to still fall along group lines. So implicitly here, just to make sure we're clear again, so for these relationships in snub-nosed monkeys, we have two different bands coming together. So they are both intergroup and long-distance relationships, whereas with humans, we're able to pull those apart.
Very interesting. So I guess that we can say that it's better, I mean, perhaps better is not the best word here, but perhaps we should assume that when we see long distance relationships, at least in humans, that the highest probability is that those people probably belong to the same group.
I think it's a reasonable place to start. And the reason for that is that if we think about the norm systems that humans have, the ways of doing things, it's often cheaper to form long distance relationships with people of the same group. And what I mean by cheaper is that I and someone living in the capital city in Bolivia, for example, we may be 6 hours apart, but if we're both from the same, say, original community, which in Bolivia, it could be the same pueblo indígena, or maybe you originally grew up in the same place, that you have the same ways of doing things, the same ways of interacting, the same expectations when it comes to cooperation. And so long distance relationships throughout the world are often cheaper to form with people who are from a similar place or from a similar ethnic group or linguistic group or country as you are, because you have that kind of mutual understanding. It's easier to coordinate. So I think it's a fair place to start to assume that people are members of the same group when they have long distance relationships. However, of course, that's not necessary. And we do see humans are really good at mastering some of the norms of other cultures. And so when there's a lot of incentives for long distance relationships, you might actually expect to see people are just proficient in the cultural norms of two different groups. And that's something we have a lot of evidence for in human history.
Yeah, I mean, off the record, we were talking before the interview about learning rules, and I guess that we could say that it's easier to establish and maintain relationships with people when you don't have to learn an entire new set of rules, right?
It really is. And the more different the rules are, the harder it is to get started.
Mm-hmm. So what about intergroup tolerance? What is it, and how did it evolve in humans specifically?
Can I start with non-human primates to launch?
Yes, of course. Let's go with the phylogenetics then.
I love the phylogenetic stuff for understanding this. So intergroup tolerance is something that probably evolved in two parts. And by evolved here, we can think about it, of course, over the kind of longue durée of human evolution. But we can also think about how it could evolve in the short term in terms of culture. Dare I say that culture evolution exists in non-human primates? Some people disagree about that, but I think there's evidence for it. So the first thing you need, say if we're talking about, again, non-human primates or other non-human social species, is that you need to, first of all, have a low incentive for contest. So Martin Surbeck and I have this paper from 2019 in Evolutionary Anthropology where we pull apart these two dimensions. The first one is whether or not there are these incentives for contest. So if, for example, resources are scarce, you could have incentives for members of different groups, which here, let's say we're talking about bonobos. You have different groups spending time together that can have, a few dozen individuals. And if these groups are competing over resources, then maybe there's incentive for contest. Now, you and I probably both know, as does everyone else out there, that bonobos aren't really big into the contest competition. They aren't much for fighting. They do fight, but not nearly as much as the chimpanzees, who are also equally closely related to us. You recently had Frans de Waal on, and he got into a lot of this too. And if the incentives for competition are low, this is the first thing you need. Then you can have groups come together and not fight. Step one. For step two, for intergroup tolerance, you actually need there to be some incentive for groups to actually come together. So this is incentives for encounter, as we call it. So if you have low incentives for contest, but also low incentives for encounter, different groups are just kind of randomly run into each other across the landscape. But if you actually have incentives for encounter, maybe because in the case of bonobos, so this is a paper that Stefano Lucchesi, who led this particular collaboration on bonobos, and Martin and others of us were on. You can think about how, say, learning about resource availability and where food can be found will actually be incentives for groups to come together. So then you get that incentive for encounter. So just to reiterate, so incentives for encounter and lack of incentives for contest, when combined, can lead to intergroup tolerance. Groups come together and they're in proximity with one another without fighting, which is the definition of tolerance. It's, of course, another level to then get to intergroup affiliation, so where you actually have these kinds of relationships being formed across group boundaries, and to actually have groups come together and stay together for long periods of time. That requires additional selective pressures. So in humans, you can think about very similar kinds of dynamics. So I mentioned earlier that humans have fission-fusion dynamics. So what that's meant over the course of human history, and as most people here know, humans have spent the vast majority of our evolutionary history living as foragers. We often were following resources around, living in bands, and coming together occasionally when resources were plentiful. So this is called fission fusion, where you have, say, larger groups that all identify with one another in cases of humans. Identity is important. Come together during certain parts of the year, and then other parts of the year break off into these foraging parties. And what that means is that intergroup tolerance in humans just meant, first of all, kind of having these larger aggregations of individuals coming together. And then having those affiliative relationships, say like marriage partners exchanged across what were smaller bands, or having different kinds of social contracts forged, alliances forged across these different bands, led to something more than intergroup tolerance, right? Led to this intergroup affiliation and intergroup relationships. And so, again, thinking about, say, bonobos and humans as having similar fission-fusion dynamics, you can then pull apart and again see the incentives for contest and the incentives for encounter, and how when you have low incentives for contest, high incentives for encounter, and then additional incentives for building those intergroup relationships, you can go beyond just intergroup tolerance and get to something more. That was a long-winded answer, but I hope I got to your question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I mean, later in a bit, we're going to talk about some of the field work you've done and some of the tribes you've studied, but let me just ask you, because there's this running debate in anthropology and also perhaps evolutionary psychology and other fields about how good are modern hunter-gatherer or forager societies as models of the kinds of societies, ancient societies we evolved in. I mean, how do you study human sociality in ancient preliterate societies?
So I'm going to take the first part of your question first, because I think the second part actually requires a slightly different answer. So thinking about contemporary hunter-gatherers or foragers, as I would usually like to call them. So they can provide interesting insight into human evolutionary history if, and this is a big if, the questions we're asking as researchers match their contemporary experiences. So one thing, and I know, as you said, there's a large debate about this, one thing that has been perhaps plaguing us a little bit in evolutionary anthropology is the assumptions we make about how good of a model contemporary foragers are for the evolutionary past. And I'm not the first person to say this. This is not news. As you said, this is a kind of a large ongoing debate. So I mentioned the Hadza before we were taping today. And the reason I partially mentioned the Hadza is, first, is they're a well-known group of contemporary foragers. Not all Hadza forage, just to kind of address that potential misconception. And my postdoc, Christopher Smith, works with the Hadza. And one point that Chris makes that matches my feeling as well about contemporary foragers is that the question we ask, again, has to be matched to their experience. So if we're asking questions about, say, partner choice, as he often is, we can ask those questions with the Hadza because, of course, they're still choosing social partners, much as you and I are, right, on the day-to-day. Who are we going to be friends with? Who do we cooperate with? But other questions may be more limited, right? So the Hadza have less access to land than they used to. There's been big territorial incursions onto their land by pastoralists who live in the area. And so some of the questions we might ask about foraging are somewhat more limited in the sense that they are not using the same amount of space. The other thing that's important to note about the Hadza is that, again, as I mentioned, a lot of Hadza today aren't foraging anymore. So what is it about the Hadza that are still foraging versus the Hadza that aren't? Why are certain people choosing or are otherwise constrained, structural constraints, for example, to be foragers, right? Why are they involved in that lifestyle and others aren't? So that's just something to be aware of, to kind of take a good look at the context in which contemporary foragers are living and asking questions that actually are still appropriate for that context and aren't based on an idealized version of the lives that foragers might lead, or at least led in the past. And then to answer your question about understanding what social relationships were like in ancient preliterate societies, we can, for certain questions, right, potentially use analogies from contemporary foragers, hopefully in collaboration with them. So here I want to be careful with that language I'm using, saying that we are using them as examples. I think it's important to also collaborate with contemporary foragers and actually ask them what they're interested in, give them the agency to be part of science. And a lot of people are doing that too, which is really nice. But for thinking about the ancient past, I actually think archaeology now provides us one of our best windows. So we can think about, for example, the movement of durable goods. That's something that I often look to when I'm thinking about what long distance relationships were like in the past, is looking at things like materials for making stone tools. Where did they move from? We can use the signatures of the isotopes in those materials to see where they were likely sourced, where they came from. And so then that gives us a sense of how many kilometers they covered. We don't know how many hands they passed through as they crossed that distance, whether it was just one person carrying it or whether there was a whole network of trade relationships. But what that does still do, though, just to quote here, Rob Foley and Clive Gamble, they have a nice paper on this from 2009, is that we have these kinds of exploded fission-fusion networks at least 300,000 years ago, if not 500,000 to 1 million years ago in Homo, in our genus. And the reason we think that is, again, that we see this movement of these durable goods in the fossil record, in the archaeological record. And that tells us a bit about the kinds of social networks that people had at that time.
Yeah, so it's complicated.
It's complicated, yes. I mean, this is a very anthropologist thing to say, but we need multiple lines of evidence to kind of triangulate what was happening in the past for humans, even as recently as during the late Pleistocene, which is only 12,000 to say maybe 20,000 years ago, if you want to cap it at 20,000. Even then, we're still figuring out what human sociality was like. And I still think archaeological data is the most immediate key to answering those questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always like to ask this kind of question, particularly to anthropologists who are more into studying different societies, particularly the more non-weird societies, I guess. Because, I mean, there's lots of assumptions that people make about our evolution that have implications for example, evolutionary psychology and theories surrounding mismatch in modern industrialized societies, for example. Yeah, I mean, sometimes we're working on assumptions that might be moving on more or less solid ground, and perhaps we have to be a little bit more careful about it.
I think the assumptions are pretty important. I have, on one end of the distribution, I have a colleague who cautions against any assumptions about the human evolutionary past. On the other end of the distribution, I have colleagues who do feel that they have a pretty good grip on what was happening in, say, the Pleistocene. And I think just being wary of those assumptions can be pretty important. One thing I think, if anything, that we've learned over the last couple decades in evolutionary approaches to human behavior is that when we really take a step back and look at what humans are up to, both in the past and present, humans are extremely flexible. That is one of the quintessential features of Homo sapiens and of the genus Homo more generally. And so we have to give humans credit for not necessarily falling into these neat categories that we expect them to be in. I think the human mind's really good at categorizing, and scientists also can sometimes fall into that trap too.
Yes, and I mean, even for the past almost 20 years since Joseph Henrich and collaborators identified the weird problem, right? And more recently with his work on the evolution of the weird psychology. I mean, we guess we have to be a little bit more careful when dismissing the influence culture has had even on our genetic evolution, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, the feedback between gene and culture, right? Gene culture coevolution is pretty striking in humans. And one thing I just always like to drive home, including for students, right? I still hear this pop up, this kind of nature-nurture debate. We can't understand human biology without understanding human culture, and we can't understand human culture without understanding human biology. They're so intertwined, which is why humans are so interesting to study, I might say. I'm a little biased, but.
Yeah, and even just the basic assumption that for the past, I don't know, 13,000 years or something like that, our minds didn't evolve or stayed pretty much the same. I guess at least with Henrik's work, you have to be a little bit more careful. So.
Yeah, some of the data he had in his new book was pretty suggestive, particularly the neurological data. It sounds like you did too. Yeah, we have to be careful. And this is coming from someone who has a background in evolutionary psychology. I'm trained in it as well. And I think that in some ways these perspectives, and they are increasingly meeting, they need to meet in the middle, right? So, I mean, there's certainly something to be said for understanding evolved human psychology, right? It can explain a lot of what we're doing, but that flexibility is still key, right? And I think most evolutionary psychologists and most cultural evolutionists that dichotomy, I tend to disagree with these days because a lot of folks have a lot to say about the other, and cultural evolutionists often think of themselves as evolutionary psychologists as well, just to be very clear. But that there's a lot of flexibility in the way humans think due to culture, and I think basically everyone agrees with that at this point.
I hope so.
I hope so.
Yeah. So another topic: what is parochial altruism?
So parochial altruism is interesting. Again, a preprint I have available in case people are curious. Both of the preprints I've mentioned today are with Cody Ross, a frequent collaborator of mine. And Cody and I are interested in parochial altruism because we're interested both in why it varies and how to study it better. So let me back up and actually answer your question. What is parochial altruism? So depending on who you ask, parochial altruism is either something we've been studying for decades, since the middle of the 20th century, or it's something that has really emerged in the last 20 years, thereabouts. So parochial altruism, in the way that Sam Bowles uses it and his collaborators use it, and they're the ones who really coined and used the term, combines altruism, that is favoritism towards in-group members, with competition or animus, this kind of contempt or willingness to cause harm to out-group members. I would call it, say, for those who are familiar, a low welfare trade-off ratio towards out-group members. When you combine those two things, this may explain some things in human evolution. So the idea is that if you are in a landscape where you have resources that tend to be kind of, we would call them clumped, so again, kind of in one place, that those resources could be really valuable. And it could be valuable to both access them and to defend them against access from other groups. So other groups could come in and say, have access to this resource. I prefer to have access myself. So I and an alliance of other people in this group will defend this resource against other people, right? And then we have access to it. So the idea is that if you pair those two dynamics, I will collaborate with members of my group to defend that resource, and we are in competition with other groups to make sure that they don't get it. That this can actually lead to a lot of the dynamics we see today in human sociality, where you have in-group favoritism, where you have this proneness to, we would call it tribalism, to this kind of us versus them dynamic that's happening in human social groups. And that then taking a hard look at parochialism today and how it's working can give us some insight in how it's worked in the past, and then of course also give us insight into how parochial altruism may affect politics or may affect the way that peace comes or doesn't come following civil war, right? So that's the definition of parochial altruism. And I have a few ways I could take it after this, but I will let you ask the question to decide which way I go.
Okay, so the next question I was going to ask is if it is a human universal.
So I think that the evidence suggests that parochial altruism is universally possible. So humans do have a ability to engage in parochial altruism, and you can see it kind of switched on and switched off in different people across different contexts with different targets. So it depends on who we're talking about, right? Whether this individual is behaving in a parochially altruistic way. And it certainly varies across space and across time. So yes, universally possible in humans, but not universally present. Again, that flexibility that humans have is pretty important. And just to come back to thinking about incentives for encounter and incentives for contest, this still has still has implications for thinking about how parochial altruism manifests in the 21st century. If you have high incentives for contest and low incentives for encounter, parochial altruism is relatively low cost in the sense that it's low cost for me to write off members of other groups as potential collaborative partners. On the other hand, there's a lot of problems humans have to solve that actually require that. And something that's interesting that often gets lost in the shuffle in the parochial altruism literature is that even if you go back to Sam Bowles' original models, you can have parochial altruistic tendencies where perhaps you tend to be in-group favoring and tend to have animus towards members of the out-group. But at the same time, you can still build those out-group relationships with certain others, right? You can still have those, likely in my case, long-distance relationships, getting you access to the resources you need. In this case, they just so happen to cross group boundaries. So again, just coming back to your question, instead of giving this very, it depends answer, the answer is, I think, yes, universally possible, not universally present. We have to pay attention to the conditions that activate parochially altruistic tendencies in people.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask you now about how people go about evaluating out-group strangers. And I would like to focus on two particular factors, that is risk buffering and access to resources. I mean, how do these shape how people evaluate out-group strangers?
So first thing, of course, just to bring everyone back, make sure we stay on the same page. So intergroup relationships and long distance relationships may or may not overlap, right?
Yeah.
And so here what you're alluding to is kind of these competing interests, right? So perhaps, intergroup dynamics are really important in humans. And again, they're very flexible. Humans, I think, can be far more warlike and awful than chimpanzees can be, but can also be even more tolerant and more affiliative with members of other groups than can bonobos, right? You have this huge range of what's possible. And so what you have with intergroup relationships is you have a few things that might be weighing in people's minds. A lot of folks are working on intergroup relationships in evolutionary approaches to behavior, so I want to make sure I kind of point to those. You may or may not have parasite avoidance. I'm going to kind of just point out that literature exists and then leave it because I'm not an expert in that area. That may or may not affect willingness to engage with members of other groups or members who live, individuals who live at a distance. And again, I think this is important here. The folks who are at a distance often have different exposures to parasites and pathogens. So again, pulling apart group identity and distance is important.
So there you're referring to parasite stress theory, right?
Right. And so the idea is with parasite stress theory, and you might be more familiar with the current literature than I am on this, so feel free to steer me. But the idea is that the more you interact with others, particularly others you don't regularly interact with, they might be harboring parasites and pathogens that you do not have exposure to that could be harmful for you. Your immune system isn't prepared for them. The thing to remember here is that these social networks can be structured on group membership, but they can also be structured on distance or a combination of the two, right? So Something to think about, again, thinking about human sociality, is to, again, pull those apart, even when thinking about parasite and pathogen stress. Did I clarify?
Yes. I mean, I was just thinking about Randy Thornhill's work, right? And I think it's Greg Palmer also, or
as well.
Yeah. No, because I was just remembering the interview I've done with him. I did with him in 2018 about parasite stress theory and also the implications it has for the frequency of certain personality traits like extroversion, for example, and the willingness to interact with strangers, for example.
And there's still an interesting literature that I think is actively grappling with parasite stress and personality, because of course personality varies so much across cultures. And so I think that literature is interesting, but I'm not up to date on it, so I will pass on deep diving further. So parasite stress may be something that can be a disincentive for intergroup contact or for long distance contact, right? It's important to keep those separate. Additionally, something that in humans often really can structure groups, and this is where cultural evolution, which is also part of my background, comes in, is that you can have institutions that is kind of collections of norms or rules, for example, that can structure the interactions that happen or don't happen between groups. So thinking about, for those of you out there who are in a different part of the social sciences, we can think about structure and agency, right? So structure is often something that can come in even from something as simple as social norms, right? So is it normative to interact with members of those other groups? Will I be ostracized, right? Will I be punished for interacting with them? So what's important here, kind of coming again long way around, is that when we're thinking about intergroup relationships, something Cody and I think are particularly important is pulling apart preferences from behavior. So it could be that my features of my evolved psychology are really attuned to the affordances, the potential benefits of being connected to a member of a different Pueblo indígena in Bolivia, or to someone who lives in the city when I live in the country. On the other hand, my ability to actually realize those relationships can depend on a lot of things. What are the local norm systems that potentially curb that? In pastoralists, for example, you can often really see when there's a lot of intergroup conflict that it's really hard to forge a relationship that crosses between those groups. Additionally, do I have the money and time to build an intergroup relationship? So again, this is where distance can get conflated with groups, right? So if I am living, say, I live in the inland northwest of the US, so this is away from the coast, kind of over in the Idaho, Montana, Eastern Washington area. If we're thinking about Native and Indigenous peoples who lived in this part of what is now the US, basically what this means is that if I want to build connections from one part of this area to another, I have to have the time to visit, or we have to all come together seasonally when there's an abundance of resources. So if we don't have that kind of gathering, then I have to have the resources or time to build those relationships. But again, just to pull those apart, this is again when we run into, when we're thinking about intergroup relationships and human sociality, we're again often conflating them with distance. So pulling those apart, a lot of those costs of travel and time will be higher for long distance relationships than intergroup. Because if you're in Bolivia, for example, you might have two pueblos indígenas who are right next to each other. So that distance and cost in terms of money, say to go visit, is not as big of a hurdle. So many answers to your questions. The three I want everyone to kind of get here is maybe parasite stress. Additionally, thinking about coordination, again, coming back to that with norms. And further, whether you're even allowed to, right, whether you get ostracized or punished if you try to form intergroup relationships. And then if we're thinking about intergroup relationships as being distant, we also have to think about the costs of time, of money, and even of things like giving gifts, right, to keep those relationships open.
Yeah. I mean, just a side comment talking about culture. There in the US, in the South, you also have the interesting phenomenon of honor culture in certain states,
Mm.
right? That also links in a
Mhm.
way to parasite stress, at least if we are to believe Randy Thornhill's explanation, because we also have Richard Nisbet's explanation that is more culture centered and less biology driven, let's say. So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So both of these things could be at work, depending on, well, depending on what we find. I was going to say, depending on which literature we read, but of course, I don't think it should be limited to that, right? We should be asking these hard questions and taking a step back and looking at intergroup relationships from both lenses to see what's really going on. And I think there's still a lot to be understood about human intergroup relationships because we're so prone to thinking it's one thing or the other, or thinking that that's what is the number one thing structuring human sociality, when in fact we're pretty flexible.
Yeah. So, shifting gears a little bit, tell us something about some of your field work. For example, in the Bolivian Amazon. Tell us a
Sure.
little bit about the kinds of societies you've studied there.
Absolutely. I'll start with Bolivia, and then I will probably come around and talk just a little bit about Tanzania,
Yeah.
which is where my lab is currently focusing work. So I have been working in Bolivia since 2010, although I should say that thanks to the pandemic, I haven't been back since 2018, and I miss folks there. And in total, I've spent about a year and a half in Bolivia, just to give everyone a sense of context. So I've worked with three different populations there. They're all horticulturalists. So one is the Tsimane. For those of you not familiar with the Tsimane, their name is spelled Tsimane, so it makes it easier to Google. The Tsimane have been pretty well studied by evolutionary and cultural anthropologists, even linguists at this point as well. So they are horticulturalists, and what we mean by horticulture, just so we're all on the same page here, is we're talking about farming, but farming that usually doesn't involve a plow or irrigation. So often using, in the past, digging sticks to plant plants, but today what the Tsimane are often using, of course, are shovels, right, just like everyone else uses. And oftentimes for contemporary horticulturalists, it often involves slash and burn farming. So what that means is that you have this rotation between different plots of land that your family tends to use, and you cut down trees and brush and burn them, which adds a lot of nitrogen to the soil. This is really important, particularly in the tropics where the Tsimane live, because it basically fertilizes the soil in ways that we might do in industrialized nations with fertilizer. And then what that means is that the soil is rich enough to actually use to grow crops for a certain number of years, say 4 years. Then what happens is that you let your field lie fallow and you move on to the next field. And you kind of do this in a circular way. So this is often called shifting cultivation for that reason. So the Tsimane are still engaging in horticulture. They're sometimes selling crops for money, and they sometimes are eating what they produce. Most of what they eat is what they produce. And they still, if available, will hunt, although there's a lot less game to hunt now than there used to be, because there's been incursions onto their land. The Tsimane population is also growing, and so there's less room for everyone. And the Tsimane are interesting because, again, thinking about context, the Tsimane have pulled back often from contact with members of other groups. So over the course of their history, particularly with the Spanish with colonial occupation, but even before that with other groups at times, when things don't go well, the Tsimane have kind of pulled back. So the place where they live now, Tsimane territory, is not what it used to be because they have pulled back because of lack of interest and continued contact because of wars, for example, that have happened in the past, small-scale warfare. And so it's an interesting place to study intergroup dynamics, which is what I was first studying in Bolivia when I was working with the Tsimane. So the Tsimane are interesting, but I've also worked with two other populations there. One of those is the Moseten. So the Moseten have historically intermarried with the Tsimane. They basically were one population for quite a long time. They speak different dialects of the same linguistic isolate. So what that means is that different languages, indigenous languages, have kind of swept through the area and eliminated our understanding of the phylogeny of Tsimane and Mosotenen. It's called Mosotenen. They're two languages they speak. And so we don't really know that linguistic history very well. Genetic history suggests these two groups have intermarried quite a bit with people who live up in the foothills of the Andes rather than with people in the Amazon basin. So they're right there, getting ahead of myself here, but they're right there along the edge of the Andes where you're still in the Amazon, but it's not flat anymore. So the Mosotenen were basically made contact with a lot of people, including the Inca, who had less contact with the Tsimane. And as of the 19th century, the Catholics were really involved with the Mosotenen. And so the Mosotenen have been speaking Spanish for a lot longer than the Tsimane. More Mosotenen speak Spanish than do the Tsimane. And so they're far more market integrated, as we would say, participating in markets than the Tsimane are. So they sell a lot of cash crops, things like chocolate, oranges, rice, plantain, things like that. And then the other group I've worked with there also practice horticulture, but they're interesting because this tells us a little bit about the power of cultural evolution. So these groups were basically part of a program that the government funded in Bolivia in the late 1960s, where they were moved down from the highlands where population pressures were kind of getting to be intense. So these are Aymara and Quechua peoples who are not pastoralists, right? They are small-scale farmers I said pastoralists. They're small-scale farmers and pastoralists, not horticulturalists by background. But what has ended up happening is they moved to the lowlands as they learned how to do horticulture. So some of them learned it through individual learning, kind of trial and error. Others adopted it from the Mosotenen, learning from the Mosotenen, which has been interesting for the Mosotenen because then these groups, they're called the interculturales, which means multicultural in Spanish. They then sometimes actually have taken Mosotenen land. So there's been some tension between these two groups. And what's also interesting is that despite the fact that they practice horticulture, they've brought a lot of cultural institutions with them from the highlands. So they have this very kind of hierarchical cargo system, meaning it's basically cargo in Spanish means you're in charge of something, right? So everyone takes turns in these different community roles. So you have this combination of highland systems of norms, of ways of doing things combined with lowland ways of producing things and the norms that come along with that. I feel like I'm giving you very long-winded answers. I apologize. It's the anthropologist curse.
No,
these are really interesting
please keep going because it's very interesting. So.
Okay, just checking. So these are really interesting groups for studying intergroup dynamics because of the tensions they've had with one another, because of Bolivia today, where you have this plurinational state where basically transitioning from what in Bolivia was a government dominated by people of European descent or mestizos to an indigenous government, right? And a constitution that recognizes indigenous rights. You go from indigenous groups working together for indigenous recognition to then actually needing to compete with one another for access to resources from the government. And the government often gives more resources to groups that are actually basically more indigenous, who are still living on their lands, big scare quotes on that, more indigenous, right? Living on their original lands, speaking their traditional languages, and engaging in their usos y costumbres, their ways of doing things and of governing. So it's created these tensions, made it really interesting for studying intergroup relationships, but still working in rural Bolivia has also been really interesting for studying long distance relationships, because if you're rural in Bolivia and you are engaging in some cash cropping, you're really subject to downturns, to floods, to droughts that really affects production. And so being able to, say, transfer money through banking apps between the country and the city, or to be able to send your kids to college and have some place for them to stay in the city, has really made long distance relationships important for Bolivian horticulturalists in 2022.
So do you want to tell us also about your current projects in Tanzania?
Sure, I will, yeah. So this is in collaboration with Monique Borgerhoff-Mulder, who's a co-PI on this project, and with Chris Smith, I mentioned before, my postdoc, and with other folks in Tanzania. So these include people working for non-governmental organizations, consultants, and so forth. And we're studying fisheries, which is very different from Bolivia, which is a landlocked country. And in Tanzania, the fisheries are really interesting. So the reason we came to study fisheries in Tanzania is that I'm really interested in long-distance relationships. And I'm really interested in how human sociality can help us understand some of the pressing issues of the 21st century. One of those pressing issues is the management of natural resources. So natural resource management is receiving a lot of funding from international organizations, from governments. People are really interested in making this happen, whether it's for sustainable use of those resources, right? So we can continue to use them into the future, or even conserving them. So kind of more of a hands-off approach to encourage, say, biodiversity. And so one of the things that's interesting about this is that it really is a collective action problem. So Ricardo, you might be familiar, other folks out there might be familiar with Elinor Ostrom's work, thinking about collective action problems, how people come together to solve a common goal, particularly when it comes to accessing natural resources. A lot of the time, these are resources that can be depleted, so they can run out, but at the same time, it's really hard to keep people out. Right? They don't have these boundaries where you can, say, charge a fee for entering as easily. This is particularly a problem in my eyes when you have large natural resources. So when lots of different communities can access something like a fishery or a forest, it's so big that it's even harder to keep people out. Those different communities have different norms, right? We talked about this a little earlier. They have different ways of doing things. So what happens when you have different communities with different ways of doing things that can all access the same fishery? So we set out to answer this problem. We were interested in the insight that an evolutionary approach to human sociality and social relationships could bring to tackling natural resource management in the 21st century. And it ended up that we had this nice quasi-natural experiment happening on the Tanzanian coast. So for those of you familiar with Tanzania, it is on the Indian Ocean, and you have islands off the Tanzanian coast that are part of Tanzania, and then you have the coast of the mainland, which is where we've been doing our work. And by our work here, I mean mostly Chris's work. I have a 1.5-year-old, so I have not been in the field recently, but Chris has. He just came back from a 6-month trip. And what we're doing is studying how people's social networks may affect their resource use and may affect their willingness to, say, work with nonprofits, with non-governmental organizations in the area who want to, say, bring in closures. So when you close a certain area of the fishery and say no one's going to take an octopus from this area for a while, or no one's going to fish tuna from this area for a while, does having these, say, long-distance relationships affect people's willingness to forego benefits now to benefit others down the line? Does it change the welfare trade-off ratio? Again, this is your willingness to, let's not say willingness here, but let's say the extent to which you value somebody else's well-being and their outcomes relative to yours, how you make that trade-off. How much do you value those other people? And is it affected by the existing relationships you have? And does that have implications for natural resource management? So we have a lot of data we're coming through, but we're talking about data from over 1,500 individuals from 28 different communities.
Yeah. So I have one last topic I would like to explore today, and then as we talked before the interview, we will probably schedule another one just to have an interesting talk about how anthropologists go about integrating into the societies they want to study, because some interesting questions came to mind when we were talking before. So climate change. What are the aspects of climate change that anthropologists are most interested in terms of what affects human societies?
Yeah. So first thing I want to note here, so thinking about anthropologists more broadly, I particularly think evolutionary anthropologists need to focus more on climate change. Cultural anthropologists are, and archaeologists have been doing quite a good job of that. Tim Kohler, who's in my department, for example, has really been looking at climate change for a long time, particularly in the context of the US Southwest. And he's part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC as well. So archaeologists are definitely involved in this. So I'll speak just for evolutionary anthropologists here. I think we should focus more on climate change. And here's why I think climate change is relevant to us, to come back to your question first. So humans have been adapting to climate change for a long time. If we're thinking about, for example, genetic adaptation, right? Well, we'll go ahead and pull them apart now, even though we know that they're so intertwined. If we think about bipedality, for example, there's an argument to make that bipedality evolved in humans because of climate change, right? Because of the shrinkage of forests in Africa. There's an argument to be made that climate change, particularly climate variability, that really got amplified during the Pleistocene, tells us something about human brain evolution, why our brains got so big, and about the human foraging niche. Here, I just want to give a quick nod when I talk about bipedality to folks like those working at the Smithsonian here in the US, and also thinking about the Pleistocene and what happened with human minds, thinking about Pete Richardson's work, for example. So we know just from these two really quintessential features of what it means to be human, the fact that we walk on two legs and our big brains and everything that comes along with that, from the fact that we engage in cooperative breeding to the fact that we really rely on meat, has to do with climate and climate change. And then, of course, the other thing we need to think about turning to culture is that humans have been dealing with variable climate and shifts in climate for as long as we've been around. So there's lots of ethnographic data and archaeological data that shows us that humans have been responding culturally to climate change through things like those I mentioned earlier, things like migration, or diversifying resource portfolios, or engaging in risk pooling. So we've been doing it for a very long time. The issue is that something called climate change adaptation, which I know you wanted to ask me about, so I'll go ahead and just get right to it. Something called climate change adaptation is being prioritized by governments, as it should be, and by international organizations today. The IPCC has just released a report calling for us to pay more attention to how we can adapt to contemporary climate change. The thing is that when people talk about climate change adaptation, folks who listen to this podcast might be thinking about adaptation, risk management, right? That can promote survival and reproduction, right? Can promote our fitness. And for folks who talk about climate change and adaptation, what they usually mean is change in response to or anticipation of climate change. So this can be everything from changes in infrastructure to changes in the way that communities fish, right? Mm-hmm. That can count as climate change adaptation. Yep. I always make the argument that infrastructure is also cultural, so we need to think about how culture impacts the infrastructure we're using. But what this really does is it kind of brings us back full circle in that the communities that evolutionary anthropologists are often collaborating with today are often on the front lines of climate change. And oftentimes we're not asking questions about climate change adaptation, or if we are collecting data on it, it's often bycatch. It's often coming through ethnographic data we're getting that maybe not is the central focus of our research. And so the case that some co-authors and I have recently made in places like Nature Climate Change and also American Journal of Human Biology, there's a special issue in case anyone wants to check that out, is that evolutionary anthropologists should be studying climate change adaptation, and we should be talking about what evolutionary approaches to human behavior in general can tell us about cultural adaptations to climate change, because the conversation's happening without us, and not just because we have FOMO and feel like we're being left out, but because we need to pay more attention to the solutions communities already have in the solutions we're funding in 2022, when we're tackling contemporary climate change and how communities are responding. we need community voices. Some people are also calling for that, and that's important. But we also need to attend to that in the context of adaptation in humans more generally.
Mm-hmm. So this is something I brought to the table off the record, but do you think that contemporary forager societies have good enough mobility if and when, and in the case they already are being affected by climate change, in if, for example, the plant and animal species they tend to consume just go extinct, or there's a general lack of resources?
Yeah. So for those of you out there familiar with foragers, foragers are impressive in the sense, well, in many ways, but in the sense that there's often a lot of flexibility in diets for foragers. That varies quite a bit, as archaeologists will tell us readily, but foragers often have a portfolio of resources from most preferred to least preferred foods, and they will pursue different ones, right? And so in the past, when foods haven't been available, you can pursue a different one. In the past, when a food becomes not available locally, mobility was an option for many mobile, non-sedentary foragers. Again, not all foragers are able to move or even wanted to move in the past when resources were plentiful. What happens today, of course, as we were talking about earlier, is that you have less access to land. The Hadza have been hemmed in by pastoralists. You also have, as you mentioned, species that might be disappearing or going extinct in certain areas. Other invasive species might be moving in. Is that an opportunity or not with those invasive species? It depends on the group. It depends on who's doing the foraging. But we have all these ways, from the activities of state societies to climate change today, that makes it really hard to be a forager. This is likely to only accelerate a lot of the transitions we're seeing in forager societies. So, and I think this spreads to a larger conversation, not just thinking about groups, say, like the Hadza, who I mentioned earlier, but also, say, the fishers who are living on the coast of Tanzania. Mm-hmm. Fishers, I think, are underappreciated for how much they are foragers. They have patches they visit. They are able to move their boats around to different places, particularly if they're engaging in migratory fishing. And they are following fish species that also are moving to different waters because of temperature changes, right? And the food availability for those fish.
Yeah.
So we can think about it not only in the context of, say, just who we, as scholars of evolutionary approaches to behavior, tend to think about the foragers being. We can also think about it in terms of what fishers are up to these days, or even folks who are engaging in other kinds of subsistence production who are affected by climate change. Their ability to access the species they have in the past is shifting. And a lot of the same themes that emerge from what we know about conservation biology come to apply to climate change. And that includes things like having outside options for communities who want them. So if fishing is no longer a viable option, what are fishers going to do? How is the local government going to provide opportunities, if at all? What can we do in terms of the organizations we fund and support to support these communities? And how can we do it with our eyes open with respect to the adaptations communities might already have and the places where they might actually need support, where they don't have solutions that are working well for them right now?
Mm-hmm. So in the very beginning of our conversation, we talked about long-distance relationships. Do they apply, or do they play a role in how communities deal with climate change?
They do. So, not speaking from my own data, but speaking from what we generally know out there in the development sector in academia, and from government data as well, is basically that, first of all, people are moving. I mentioned this earlier in our conversation today, that a lot of the movement from Central to North America, for example, is being spurred by climate change, often in combination with something else. Something I always remind my students is that usually it's not climate change by itself, right? But often climate change combined with something else, mm-hmm. Instability in a government, for example, or gangs, right, have been particularly an issue in Honduras. So Climate change is causing migration. That's something that is generally pretty well known. And that relies on long distance relationships, right? So people are pulling on those relationships to move, as I mentioned. Long distance relationships also become important as people are experiencing droughts, remittances. That means sending money from one place to another is something else that's been really important when people are, say, experiencing a hurricane, right? So that means everyone in your local area is hit by that hurricane. What do you do? And one of the really powerful examples, I think, for those of you familiar with the U.S. and with changes in the U.S. with respect to hurricanes, tornadoes, winter storms, is that oftentimes these, again, have really big geographic scope. So if you look at what happens on the Gulf Coast, in places like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, when hurricanes strike, you often have people descending from different areas to come in and support individuals who are there. And you also have people who leave that area and go stay with friends in other places, right? So these hurricanes strike, people take cars out and go stay with friends somewhere else. Yeah. There again is your long distance relationship. So they're really important in the face of climate change. And I think something we have to grapple with in general, and by we, I mean as citizens, taxpayers, policymakers, is that people often want to move, or if they don't want to move, it may be temporary, I should say temporary or permanently. If they don't want to move, they're often reaching out for funds or for some other source of support from some other part of the world. Do we facilitate that? How? What are the limits? What kind of support do communities want and need? And how can international organizations, for example, meet them in the middle despite, say, lack of political will to support migration? So what do we do, and how do we meet communities in the middle? I think that's something that we can help tackle as scholars, as evolutionary researchers.
Mm-hmm. So one last question then. The knowledge anthropologists, evolutionary anthropologists more specifically in this case, can get from how human communities across the world deal with climate change, can it apply to modern industrialized societies and how we ourselves deal with it?
Mm-hmm. So just really quickly on the word modern, and I know you know this, but just to be really
I mean, modern, of course, we also have modern, I mean, non-industrialized societies. I know that the word modern is not the best to use here, but yeah.
Well, absolutely. And I figured I would tackle both sides of your question there. So thinking about lessons from the past for the present, we have, if we look at the archaeological record, there's some great authors out there on this for people who want more of kind of a easy to read book. You can look at works by Brian Fagan. There's a couple really nice books on this. And if you want to kind of take more of an academic angle, Tim Kohler, Stephanie Crabtree, and others have really been thinking about climate change in archaeology. We have a lot of failed experiments in human history in terms of what cultural adaptations do and do not work well in the face of climate change. We can look no further than say, the fall of Rome to get some insights. Perhaps the Maya, classic Maya, depending on who you ask. Some people disagree about that, right? But still some insight. Go ahead, please.
I mean, I think that just for the more general public, perhaps a good place to look at would also be Collapse by Jared Diamond. He also tackles these sort of questions.
He does. So I will say just a note for everyone that some archaeologists do take issue with some of the generalizations that Jared Diamond makes.
Yes, I'm aware of that. It's just that, I mean...
It's still really interesting.
Yeah,
work, right?
and I mean, just to get introduced to the topic, let's say.
Yeah, I think Collapse is a good book. I really like The Long Summer by Brian Fagan, and I assign it to my students, but I'm really getting kind of behind the curtains here. This is a new book called Climate Chaos by Brian Fagan that I'm looking into potentially using for my class. So far, it's been an easy read and accessible. So those are books to look to. And so we can think about, again, human societies in the past, Old Kingdom Egypt, to name another, where we have lessons we've learned about things that didn't work. So again, thinking about modern and past examples do hold insight for us. And thinking about contemporary peoples around the world. So looking to subsistence communities and working with them, I think that's going to be really important here, collaborating with them to support the solutions they want while also learning from them, is that we can learn about ways that subsistence communities in different parts of the world are responding. I'm PI on a grant. We're looking for funding now, looking at 5 different populations from around the globe who are on the coast, who are inland, who are living in an area with ice, right? The lessons from those 5 populations should translate to one another, even though one is facing more wind, another is facing more hurricanes and so forth. But additionally, those should also translate to exactly what folks are experiencing who are not engaging in subsistence production, to folks who are buying most of their food, which is probably most of you out there, right, who are listening. We can think about how responses like, say, how we shift our portfolios, right, the kinds of resources we rely on, where money is coming from and how, might be relevant in the face of, say, those hurricanes I mentioned on the Gulf Coast of the US, right? Or might be relevant in flooding that is impacting Europe, right? And has impacted Europe pretty heavily. So I think the lessons do translate. And I think one of the things that, just kind of as a summary as well for today's conversation, to remember is that we'd almost do a disservice to humans, to us, right, if we partition ourselves off and say that this is what foragers do and this is what post-industrial nations do, or this is what happened in the past and this is what's happening in the present. Yes, some things are different, and that's important, but some things are the same. We still have that same evolved psychology. We still have that same anatomy, right? We still have, walking on 2 legs, still have those big brains. That means that looking back tens to hundreds of thousands of years is still relevant for contemporary problems. And so I think just the take-home message here is that, yes, looking at subsistence communities and how they're responding can provide lessons for non-subsistence communities in the contemporary world. And I think keeping these lessons from the past, the present, from even comparisons to our closest relatives can really give us some important insight into human nature and into the most pressing issues we face in the 21st century, like climate change.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that's a great point to end on. Just before we go, would you like to mention where people can find your work on the internet, and if you want to plug in any websites for people to get into and to learn more about the projects you're involved in, feel free to do it. Absolutely.
Okay. So my lab's website, my lab is called the Human Sociality Lab. Our website is www.pisor, so that's my last name, so PISOR -lab.com. If you're not sure how to spell all that or get it all together, you can just Google me. You'll find it. And on that website, you can find access to all of my papers. So that's under the papers tab, and under the tab on sites, you can read more about Tanzania, about Bolivia, and on the research tab, what we're up to. So there's a whole team of us doing lots of interesting different work, if I may say. You can also find me on Twitter, so Ann Pisor. It's all one word, and I'm happy to answer questions people have. I'm sure there'll be some that emerge from this conversation, so feel free to email or to tweet me or DM me, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Okay, great. So look, thank you so much for your time. I'm very much looking forward to our next conversation, and it was a real pleasure and very fun to talk to you.
Likewise, yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, hit the subscription button, all of those things you already know. And please consider supporting the show either on PayPal or Patreon. All of the links will be in the description box of the interview, starting at $1 per month, so it would be a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, KARIN, LIETZCKE and BLANCHETTE, LARSEN, GUERREIRO, Francis Ford, Hans, FREDRIK, SUNDE, RICARDO, VLADIMIRO, Craig, HEALY, Adam Castle, OLAF, Alex, Jonathan VISSER, JAKOB, KLINKBY, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Muller, Herbert, GINTIS, Rutger Vosbo, Weingard, Rebecca Newberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila DEZA-ARAUJO, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula LIETZCKE, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy and Trader in NYC. My producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Muller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codreanu, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.